History often carves its heroes from marble, immovable, flawless, untouchable. But the real George Washington was nothing like the statue that now towers above the American imagination. He was not born into greatness. He wasn't a prodigy, a master strategist, nor a natural political genius. In fact, the remarkable truth is that Washington's path to history was paved with miscalculations, humiliations, and an almost relentless chain of decisions that should have destroyed his career before it ever began. This is the story of a man who, by all logic, by all probability, and by every conventional measure, shouldn't have won. And yet, he did. To understand Washington, we must begin not with triumph, but with the insecurity that drove him. George Washington entered the world in 1732 on a modest Virginia plantation, not the grand estate often imagined. When his father died suddenly, 11-year-old George found himself cut out of the family's primary inheritance, leaving him without the wealth, land, or connections that defined status in colonial society. He watched his older half-brothers step into positions of influence and opportunity while he remained in the background. It was this early experience, this quiet awareness of his own insignificance, that ignited the ambition within him. Washington would spend the rest of his life clawing toward respectability, crafting a persona rooted in dignity, discipline, and self-control. He consciously practiced the manners of the elite, the way he spoke, the way he stood, even the way he wrote. His diaries reveal hours spent copying rules of civility, shaping his handwriting to match that of gentlemen he admired. To Washington, identity was not inherited, it was constructed. But ambition alone wouldn't carry him far. Colonial Virginia's ruling class guarded its privileges closely. For young Washington, the military offered the one narrow path upward, especially during the escalating tensions between France and Britain over the Ohio Valley. And so, at just 21 years old, Washington volunteered for a mission that would propel him directly into the heart of global conflict. The year was 1753. Britain and France were locked in a silent struggle for control of the North American interior. Washington was given a task both dangerous and prestigious: deliver a message to the French demanding they vacate territory claimed by the British Crown. Washington completed the mission successfully, but what came next would transform a regional dispute into the opening spark of the 7 Years' War, a conflict that would reshape the world. Just months later, Washington returned to the frontier leading a small force of Virginia militiamen. His orders were vague, the intelligence unreliable. Yet driven by ambition and a desire to prove himself, Washington launched a surprise attack on a French encampment at Jumonville Glen. Muskets thundered through the forest. Chaos erupted. When the smoke cleared, the French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, lay dead, killed under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. Some say Washington ordered the attack outright. Others claim he was misled by his native allies. But the result was clear. The young Virginian had fired the shot that ignited a war stretching across continents. For the British, it was a diplomatic disaster. For Washington, it was a moment of triumph that would almost immediately collapse into catastrophe. Aware that French retaliation was inevitable, Washington constructed a crude circular stockade he called Fort Necessity. The name, perhaps, should have been a warning. The fort sat in a marshy meadow, flat, exposed, and impossible to defend. When French and native forces surrounded the structure, rain turned trenches into rivers of mud. Gunpowder became soaked and useless. Washington's men panicked. After a day of fighting, he surrendered. It was a humiliation so complete that it should have ended his military career forever. Worse still, the surrender document, written in French, a language Washington did not understand, included a confession that he had assassinated Jumonville. When news reached Europe, Washington became a symbol of British aggression, a reckless colonial officer who had triggered a global conflict. Yet this failure, rather than destroying him, forged the beginnings of the general he would one day become. The defeat at Fort Necessity taught Washington his most important early lessons: that courage alone was no substitute for strategy, that boastful aggression led to disaster, and that mistakes, his mistakes, could have world-shaking consequences. These lessons would shape him for the rest of his life, instilling a caution and discipline that contrasted sharply with the impulsive young officer he had once been. But although Washington had disgraced himself diplomatically, the war soon presented him with opportunities to redeem his reputation. When General Edward Braddock launched his fateful 1755 expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, Washington joined as an aide. The campaign ended in disaster as British troops marched into a deadly ambush. Officers fell by the dozens. Horses collapsed. Soldiers fled. Washington's actions in the chaos became the stuff of legend. Bullets pierced his coat. 2 horses were shot out from under him. Yet Washington seemed to move through the battlefield untouched, rallying soldiers, delivering orders, and risking his life repeatedly. Native leaders who fought against him later said he was protected by a divine force, that the Great Spirit shielded him. Washington himself came to believe, in some quiet unspoken way, that perhaps he was meant to survive for a reason. With the war's end, Washington returned to Virginia a hardened veteran. Though denied the British commission he desperately wanted, he emerged with something more valuable: experience, visibility, and the beginnings of a reputation for steady leadership. He married the wealthy widow Martha Custis, gaining the stability and social position he had long sought. At Mount Vernon, he cultivated the appearance of a gentleman planter, but politics, not farming, dominated his ambitions. Throughout the 1760s and 70s, tensions with Britain escalated. Taxes, restrictions, and imperial overreach fueled resentment among the colonies. Washington watched with increasing alarm as Parliament imposed control over colonial trade and governance. His writings during this period reveal a man who feared not just taxation, but the erosion of the rights and status he had fought so hard to earn. By 1775, rebellion was no longer unthinkable, it was inevitable. When the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, they sought not merely a military leader, but a unifying figure who could bind the fractious colonies together. Washington, towering, reserved, and dressed in a blue military uniform, became the obvious choice. His presence signaled commitment without arrogance, ambition without instability. On June 15, 1775, Congress unanimously appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. His new army was untrained, poorly equipped, undisciplined, and disastrously inconsistent. Facing the world's most powerful empire with such a force bordered on hopeless, Washington understood immediately that he would not win by seeking decisive battles. He would not win by aggression. He would not win by brilliance. He would win by survival. He knew this because his own life had taught him the price of impetuousness. The young officer who built Fort Necessity would have been destroyed by the British within months, but the older Washington understood that endurance, not glory, would decide the war. And so began a struggle unlike any other in the history of revolution, a war where the objective was not to defeat the enemy outright, but to prevent one's own army from disappearing. Washington would suffer losses so severe they almost broke him. He would lead retreats that preserved the army by inches. He would hold together a cause that often seemed lost. Because Washington, more than any other leader of his age, understood that victory is not always earned by brilliance. Sometimes, it is earned simply by refusing to lose. This is the paradox that defines him, the man who shouldn't have won, but did. By the summer of 1776, the ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry when the newly formed United States faced a brutal truth. Great Britain was coming, and it was bringing the largest military force it had ever assembled outside Europe. The British Empire had money, fleets, trained regiments, artillery, discipline, and experience. The Americans had enthusiasm, improvised uniforms, and a general who had never commanded more than a few thousand men in battle. And the war was about to turn against him. When Washington arrived in New York City that summer, the scale of the challenge became terrifyingly clear. Across the harbor, ships began appearing on the horizon, first dozens, then scores, then hundreds. It became one of the largest amphibious landings in the 18th century. Merchant ships, warships, troop transports, they filled the water like a floating city. British cannons gleamed under the sun. Drums echoed across the waves. New Yorkers, watching from rooftops, said the masts looked like a forest rising from the sea. Washington's troops were stunned. Many broke ranks to stare in awe. Others whispered that resistance was hopeless. Washington himself stood silently for a long moment, his face carved in stone, realizing the war he had spent a lifetime preparing for was about to begin, and that he was dangerously unprepared. The British commander, General William Howe, planned to trap Washington's army in Brooklyn and crush the rebellion in a single blow. His strategy was sound. His army was disciplined. Washington, on the other hand, was facing his first major test as commander-in-chief, against an enemy far superior in every measurable way. Washington's first mistake came quickly. Believing the British would attack head-on, he fortified the center of his lines but left his flanks exposed. Howe, a veteran of European warfare, recognized the opening. Under cover of darkness and thick forest, he sent a massive force to sweep around Washington's left side. When dawn broke, the Continental Army found itself nearly encircled. The Battle of Long Island became a slaughter. American troops were outmaneuvered and outgunned. Entire regiments collapsed in panic. Soldiers fled into swamps and forests. Washington, watching from a nearby ridge, was horrified. Some accounts say he wept openly. Others describe him shouting at retreating soldiers, furious, helpless, unable to believe how fast everything had fallen apart. By all logic, this should have been the end of the revolution. But for the first time in the war, Washington's greatest talent appeared. Not brilliant tactics, not sweeping victories, but the ability to see catastrophe coming and retreat just before it arrived. Howe's army prepared to finish the job the next morning. Washington understood that staying meant annihilation, so he made a decision that would become a signature of his military leadership. He ordered the entire army to escape, at night, across water, under the nose of the enemy. The plan was almost impossible. Washington gathered every available boat, fishing craft, rowboats, scows, and began ferrying men across the East River back to Manhattan. The operation took all night. Soldiers wrapped rags around oars to soften the sound. Officers whispered commands. No fires were lit. Horses, cannons, and wagons were loaded in darkness. But dawn approached too quickly. Thousands still remained on the Brooklyn side. If the British saw them, it was over. And then, nature intervened. A heavy fog rolled in from the river, thick, impenetrable, muffling sound and sight. British scouts couldn't see more than an arm's length ahead. Washington's army faded into the mist as if swallowed by the earth. When the fog finally lifted hours later, the British discovered an empty shoreline. Washington had escaped, by inches. But retreat did not mean safety. What followed was a series of losses that nearly destroyed the Continental Army. The British drove Washington out of Manhattan, then out of Harlem Heights, then out of White Plains. Each battle chipped away at morale. Each retreat deepened doubt. Soldiers deserted in alarming numbers. Supplies dwindled. Congress questioned his leadership. Some whispered that Washington was in over his head. By November, Washington had been pushed out of New York completely. The British seized Fort Washington, capturing almost 3,000 American soldiers, one of the worst defeats of the war. A month later, the army was reduced to a few thousand starving, demoralized men stumbling across New Jersey, pursued relentlessly. This was the bleakest period of Washington's life. He rode at the head of a dying army through snow and mud, watching footprints fill with blood. Men wrapped their feet in rags. Some had no shoes at all. Washington listened to officers debate whether the revolution was doomed. Even his closest allies feared collapse. Letters to Congress grew increasingly desperate. Washington begged for food, blankets, reinforcements, anything. Congress, fracturing under political pressure, delivered little. Many believed the rebellion could not survive the winter. Washington himself was not immune to despair. But he did not break. Instead, he understood something profound. If the army simply dissolved, if the Continental Army ceased to exist, even without a decisive British victory, independence would die. Britain could then simply declare the rebellion defeated. So Washington made the decision that changed the war. He would stop retreating. He would stop waiting. He would take a risk so bold, so reckless, so utterly unexpected that it bordered on madness. He would attack. And he would do it in the dead of winter, on Christmas night, against a professional garrison of Hessian soldiers stationed in Trenton. Washington knew this was not about military glory. It was about survival, psychological, political, and symbolic. The revolution needed a victory, any victory, to prove that the cause was not a lost dream. The soldiers needed confidence. Congress needed hope. The world needed proof that America still lived. On December 25, 1776, with icy winds howling across the Delaware River, Washington gathered his weary army for a desperate gamble. The river was choked with ice. Snow whipped against their faces. Boats nearly capsized under the weight of men and equipment. Horses panicked. Cannon wheels froze. It took hours longer than planned to get across. Some soldiers collapsed from the cold. Others died from exposure. Yet Washington pressed forward. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Trenton. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, were overwhelmed in a matter of minutes. The victory was small by European standards, but for Washington, it was monumental. It electrified the colonies. Newspapers declared the general revived from ruin. Men re-enlisted. Spirits soared. Washington, with a single stroke, had wrestled the revolution back from the brink. But victory came at a price. Trenton was not the grand turning point, yet. British forces soon regrouped. Washington would have to fight, and retreat, and fight again. Still, something had changed. The Washington who had once been overwhelmed by the scale of British power now understood its weaknesses. He grasped the importance of unpredictability. He recognized that mobility could substitute for might. He learned that survival, not conquest, was the heart of the American strategy. And perhaps most importantly, the world now knew that the revolution was not dead. But the darkest challenges still awaited him: betrayal, mutiny, conspiracies, starvation, and political enemies determined to strip him of command. The war would grow harder, not easier. Yet Washington had crossed a threshold within himself. He had endured humiliation, disaster, and fear, and found a way forward. The man who shouldn't have won had discovered his greatest weapon. Not brilliance, not power, but resilience. And it would be resilience, not battlefield triumph, that would carry him through the darkest winter of the war. By 1777, George Washington had survived what should have been the end of the Revolution. He had escaped New York by a miracle. He had rescued the cause with a desperate gamble at Trenton. He had outmaneuvered a superior force through sheer endurance and audacity. But the next chapter of Washington's struggle would not be defined by battlefield defeat. It would be defined by something far more painful, far more corrosive. Betrayal. Not betrayal by soldiers or spies, but betrayal from within his own officer corps, from members of Congress, and even from one of the most brilliant commanders in the Continental Army. Washington had enemies, quiet ones, ambitious ones, jealous ones, men who looked at him and saw not a hero, but a symbol of everything wrong with the American command. They saw his retreats, his losses in New York, his failures against the British, and they whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, another general could win this war. And for the first time, there were candidates waiting in the wings. As 1777 opened, the British launched a massive campaign to seize Philadelphia, capital of the rebellion. Washington fought fiercely at Brandywine and Germantown, but again, the British were simply better trained, better equipped, and better supplied. Despite brave resistance, Washington failed to stop them. Philadelphia fell. To many in Congress, this was the final straw. But at that very moment, in the Northern Theater, something extraordinary happened. General Horatio Gates won the Battle of Saratoga, capturing an entire British army. It was the greatest American victory of the war so far, and Gates received instant national fame. He basked in it. He encouraged it. And his supporters used it. Overnight, Gates became the shining alternative to Washington, the man who, in their eyes, could finish the war that Washington could only prolong. And thus began the Conway Cabal, the shadowy political plot to undermine Washington's leadership. The catalyst was a single letter written by General Thomas Conway, a French-born officer whose arrogance was matched only by his ambition. In a private message to Gates, Conway criticized Washington savagely. He called him unfit for command. He praised Gates as the true hero of the Revolution. It was the kind of letter that could destroy careers. And it nearly did. The letter was supposed to remain secret. But in a twist of fate, one that historians still debate, it was leaked to Washington. When Washington read Conway's words, he was devastated. He had endured defeat by the British, but he had never imagined such betrayal from men inside his own army. With cold dignity, he wrote to Conway. A letter which I have received contains your remark, that heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it. He left the insult in the open. He neither denied it nor attacked it. He simply exposed it. The letter exploded like a powder keg. Suddenly, Washington's supporters, both in Congress and the army, rallied around him. Officers were outraged that outsiders dared challenge the man who slept beside them in trenches and crossed frozen rivers with them in the dead of night. Even ordinary soldiers learned of the plot. Many swore that the army would not fight under anyone else. Washington, who could have demanded the conspirators be expelled or punished, instead chose restraint. He understood that the revolution could not afford civil war within its leadership. But his quiet strength, his unwillingness to lash out, won him more loyalty than any battlefield victory ever had. Gates's political maneuvering quickly collapsed. Conway resigned in disgrace. The cabal disintegrated. Washington had survived the first major attempt to remove him. But the damage lingered. His confidence was shaken. His trust in Congress, already fragile, was nearly destroyed. And now he faced a winter that would test not just his leadership, but the will of the nation itself. Valley Forge. The name has become synonymous with suffering, endurance, and the razor-thin line between survival and collapse. When Washington marched his army into the Pennsylvania wilderness in December 1777, he faced not an enemy army, but a combination of starvation, disease, cold, and political negligence that almost annihilated the Continental Army completely. The scene was apocalyptic. Men built crude log huts with bare hands. Snow fell in thick, punishing sheets. Food was scarce. Some soldiers roasted their own shoes for nourishment. Thousands lacked coats or blankets. Hospitals overflowed with dysentery and frostbite. Death carts traversed the muddy fields daily. Washington walked among the camps, witnessing suffering he could hardly bear. He wrote to Congress pleading for supplies. He wrote to governors demanding quotas. He wrote to anyone who would listen. The response was silence. Committees argued. States hoarded resources. Supplies sat unused miles away while soldiers died. Some members of Congress privately blamed Washington for the suffering. They claimed he lacked imagination, that he did not seize opportunities for victory, that he had allowed the British to winter in comfort while Americans froze. Washington knew the truth: the revolution's greatest enemy was not Britain, it was indifference. He worked tirelessly to reorganize supply chains, negotiate with local farmers, and stabilize the army. He battled not only hunger, but the disillusionment of men who wondered whether their sacrifices meant anything. He wrote letters in the dead of night, begging for clothing, ammunition, medicine, anything. But Washington did not face this crisis alone. Into Valley Forge arrived a figure who would transform the Continental Army forever: Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former Prussian officer whose booming voice, impeccable discipline, and eccentric charm quickly made him indispensable. Von Steuben introduced a new standard of training: daily drills, coordinated movements, bayonet techniques, battlefield formations. He built a professional army out of frightened farmers. Washington watched with renewed hope as the men began to move as one, march as one, fight as one. By spring, the Continental Army had been forged, literally, through fire and frost. Washington's leadership during this winter, more than any battle, cemented the loyalty of his men. They saw his suffering. They saw his devotion. They saw him ride through snowstorms to inspect huts, share meals of burnt flour and water, and refuse comforts that the soldiers themselves lacked. He became not a distant general, but the beating heart of the revolution. With winter ending, the biggest threat to Washington's leadership now came not from plotters or politicians, but from the most brilliant battlefield tactician in the Continental Army: Benedict Arnold. Arnold had once been Washington's favorite general. He was brave, decisive, and audacious to the point of recklessness. He had saved the revolution at Saratoga as much as Gates had, perhaps more. But Arnold felt overlooked, unappreciated, and repeatedly insulted by Congress. His bitterness deepened. His debts grew. His pride became a wound that Washington could not heal. In 1780, Arnold committed the ultimate betrayal. He attempted to hand West Point, the most strategic fortress in America, to the British. The plot was discovered just in time. Arnold fled to British lines. Washington raced to West Point and found the fort still in American hands. When Washington learned Arnold had escaped, witnesses described him as shattered, pale, silent, devastated. Staten Island fishermen later recalled seeing Washington sitting alone on a rock, staring across the Hudson River. Washington whispered, "Whom can we trust now?" It was a moment that revealed the private cost of command. Washington could endure defeat, hunger, freezing nights, even political attacks. But betrayal, especially by a man he had once trusted, cut deeper than any musket ball. Yet even here, Washington did not fall apart. He steadied himself. He addressed the officers with calm resolve. He turned Arnold's treason into a rallying cry for unity. And so Washington emerged from this dark chapter bruised but unbroken. He had faced plots from Congress. He had endured starvation and tragedy. He had survived betrayal by elites and generals alike. But the war was far from over. As Washington looked toward the brutal campaigns that lay ahead, one truth burned clearly in his mind. He was no longer merely fighting for independence. He was fighting to keep the army alive, physically, morally, spiritually. And he was fighting to keep the idea of America alive with it. What came next would demand every ounce of strength he still had. For most revolutionary legends, history begins with triumph. With Washington, it begins with failure. And yet, paradoxically, it was this humiliating season, this painful stretch of missteps, retreats, and confusion, that forged the commander the revolution desperately needed. As 1776 unfolded, George Washington found himself commanding an army that was, in truth, more an idea than a military force. The Continental Army was barely continental and hardly an army. It was a loose patchwork of farmers, fishermen, merchants, and wanderers, patriots, yes, but untested, untrained, and often uninterested in discipline. They enlisted for 3 months at a time. Some served only until the harvest, others left because the winter was too cold. Muskets misfired. Powder was wet. Many soldiers lacked shoes, coats, or even bayonets. And standing before them was Washington, a tall, imposing figure with the aura of command but the burden of impossible responsibility. He had been chosen for political and symbolic reasons as much as for experience. But what little experience he did have. That was a mix of bravery, anger, and disastrous outcomes. Washington understood this better than anyone. So as he surveyed the army in early 1776, he saw what no one else wanted to admit: they were not ready. And more frighteningly, neither was he. The New York problem. By summer, Washington faced the greatest challenge of his early command: defending New York City. It was a city he didn't want, couldn't hold, and wasn't prepared to lose, but had to defend anyway. Politicians wanted it protected. The Continental Congress feared the political consequences of surrendering a major city. New Yorkers feared the British Navy. Washington feared all of it. New York, surrounded by water and open to naval attack, was nearly impossible to defend with the army he had. The British, meanwhile, arrived with the largest expeditionary force they would send overseas in the entire century. Tens of thousands of soldiers. A massive fleet that blotted out the horizon. Hessian mercenaries fresh from Europe. Well-trained artillery, cavalry, marines, the full weight of the empire. Washington's army? Mostly volunteers who had never faced a European army before. The imbalance wasn't just military, it was psychological. When the British fleet sailed into the harbor, American soldiers stopped what they were doing just to stare. Some dropped their muskets. Others whispered prayers. One soldier wrote, "We are lambs before lions." Washington tried to hide his own fear. He rode up and down the lines, giving stern speeches, demanding discipline, trying to look unshakable. But inside, he felt the crushing weight of his previous failures. He had never commanded an army of this scale. He had never faced a fleet like this. And he had certainly never attempted to hold a strategic city against the world's most powerful empire. Yet backing down would mean losing morale, losing political support, and maybe losing the revolution in its infancy. So he made a fatal decision. He would defend New York. It was a mistake. The disaster at Long Island. The Battle of Long Island was Washington's first major test, and it nearly destroyed the revolution. The British executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, marching silently through Jamaica Pass, a route Washington had left lightly defended. They struck from behind. The American lines collapsed. Chaos swept through the ranks. Washington, watching from a hilltop, was horrified. He saw men slaughtered, captured, or fleeing. He saw formations break apart like sand. He saw his dream of a new nation shatter in real time. And yet, even in the panic, he made the decision that would define his leadership. He chose to save the army, not the ground. He organized a nighttime evacuation under thick fog, an escape so unlikely, so miraculous, that even British officers later called it mysterious. He saved nearly his entire force and slipped away across the East River without losing a single boat. New York was lost. But the army lived. And Washington realized something profound. Holding a city did not matter. Holding the cause did. Retreat, doubt, and the collapse of confidence. After New York fell, a chain reaction began. Washington retreated across Manhattan. Then across Harlem. Then across the Hudson River. His losses were not simply geographic, they were emotional, political, and existential. Each retreat chipped away at public confidence. Newspapers questioned his competence. Members of Congress whispered about replacing him. Some generals openly doubted him. Loyalists took advantage of the chaos to spread rumors that Washington was unfit, inexperienced, incapable. Even his own soldiers were losing faith. Desertions increased. Supplies dwindled. Commanders argued. Officers begged for reinforcements that never arrived. At one point, Washington's army numbered fewer than 5,000 men, and thousands more would leave when enlistments expired at the end of the year. Washington wrote bleak letters to his brother, admitting he often felt like a man on the edge of ruin. He confessed to Congress that he did not know how much longer the army could survive. He admitted privately that he had made mistakes, that he had misjudged the battlefield, that his lack of experience had cost them dearly. But he did not quit. He did not surrender. He did not retreat inward. Instead, he turned the string of defeats into a lesson, a painful education in the harsh reality of modern war. The transformation of Washington. The Washington who retreated across New Jersey was not the same man who had marched proudly into New York weeks earlier. He learned that he could not win set-piece European battles. He learned that the Continental Army was too fragile, too inexperienced for grand maneuvers. He learned that the war would not be won by defending cities but by preserving the army itself. In the slow humiliation of defeat, Washington discovered the strategy that would eventually win the war. He did not have to win battles. He just had to avoid losing the army. He stopped trying to impress Congress. He stopped fighting by British rules. He embraced mobility, unpredictability, and survival. This was not cowardice. It was clarity. Victory would come not through glory, but through endurance. And it was at his lowest moment, retreating through frozen rivers and abandoned towns, that Washington found a final, unexpected strength. The trust of his soldiers. They saw that he did not abandon them. They saw that he shared their hardship. They saw that he refused to leave the field, even when defeat seemed inevitable. Washington was no longer the untested young officer desperate for honor. He was becoming something far more powerful, a leader hardened by failure, tempered by loss, and ready, finally, for the victories that history would one day remember. But those victories were still far away. Before he could seize them, Washington would have to survive the darkest winter of his command, and make one of the boldest gambles in American military history. And that moment was coming soon. Very soon. The winter of 1776 was not merely cold, it was apocalyptic. It was the season the American Revolution nearly died, smothered under snow, doubt, and the crushing weight of reality. For months, Washington had retreated. From New York. From New Jersey. From positions he'd sworn to defend. From expectations that had been impossible from the start. Now, as December crept toward its bleakest nights, Washington was a commander with almost nothing left. No victories. No secure territory. No public confidence. And soon, perhaps, no army at all. The enlistments of his remaining regiments were set to expire at the end of the year. Many soldiers were already packing. Others simply slipped away in the night. This was not desertion out of cowardice, it was desertion out of sheer hopelessness. One soldier wrote, "We have no future here but freezing, starving, and dying." And through it all, the British and their allies believed the war was, for all intents and purposes, over. General William Howe sent reports back to London explaining that the rebellion was on the verge of total collapse. His Hessian commanders bragged that a single winter sweep would finish the job. The British established winter quarters across New Jersey, scattering garrisons in small towns, comfortable, confident, and certain that the Americans were too broken to strike back. It was a fatal assumption. Washington's army at the edge of disintegration. December's winds tore through the makeshift tents at Washington's camp near the Delaware River. Food was scarce, flour was moldy, salt pork was rancid. Some soldiers boiled their belts or moccasins, softening leather into a bitter mush simply to quiet the hunger. Frostbite turned toes black. Blankets were shared by 3 men at a time. Campfires sputtered and died in the icy rain. Worst of all was the despair. Veterans of the early battles whispered that the cause was doomed. Rumors spread that Congress was preparing to flee Philadelphia. Even Washington admitted privately that he was wearied almost to death. He was fighting not against an enemy army now, but against the collapse of the revolutionary idea itself. During this time, Thomas Paine, who had marched as a volunteer with Washington's forces, wrote the words that would shape the moment. These are the times that try men's souls. In the darkness of the American winter, those words were more than rhetoric. They were a warning and a prophecy. A general without time. Washington faced an unsolvable equation. If he did nothing, the army would evaporate on New Year's Day. If the army evaporated, the revolution was dead. And if the revolution died, the men who had signed the Declaration of Independence would hang. Washington knew the stakes. He felt them with every sleepless night and every frozen dawn. He saw the hopelessness in the eyes of his soldiers. He saw the quiet resignation among his officers. But beneath those layers of despair, something else was forming. A realization. A spark. A final chance. The British had spread themselves thin, confident the Americans lacked the strength to attack. They held outposts in Trenton, Princeton, and a series of towns across New Jersey, small, isolated garrisons of Hessians and British regulars. If Washington could strike one of them, just one, he might reignite hope, extend enlistments, and prove that the American army was still alive. But attacking in winter, with his starving army, across an icy river? It was madness. And it was the only option he had left. Washington's desperation plan. In mid-December, Washington began to consider what no European commander would dare. A surprise assault in freezing conditions, on Christmas night, through darkness, snow, hail, and river ice. His target, the Hessian force at Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessians were tough, disciplined mercenaries. But they had grown complacent. British command believed the Americans were incapable of winter operations. Reports suggested the Hessians would be celebrating Christmas heavily. Washington saw an opportunity in their overconfidence. He also saw something else. Trenton was small enough to take. Symbolic enough to matter. And close enough to reach. If he could strike a decisive blow, just one, before the enlistments expired, he could convince his army to stay. He could show Congress that the war was not lost. He could prove that the revolution still had fight left in it. But he needed secrecy. He needed bravery. And he needed a miracle. Christmas night, a gamble against fate. As the sun sank on December 25th, Washington stood before his weary men, issuing the orders that would define the future of a nation. They would march to McConkey's Ferry. They would cross the Delaware River in complete darkness. They would brave ice floes, freezing winds, and a brutal winter storm. They would march 9 miles through blinding sleet. And they would attack Trenton at dawn. Officers whispered that the plan was suicide. Some soldiers doubted they could even reach the river. Others feared the Hessians, who were trained, well-fed, and well-armed, would cut them down. But Washington did not waver. For once, his inexperience became an advantage. He had no tradition to obey, no formal rulebook to follow. He was willing to do something no British commander would dare. This was not strategy. This was necessity. The river of destiny. When the army reached the Delaware River, they found a nightmare waiting. The current was swift. The water was bone-numbing. Giant sheets of ice cracked and slammed against the boats. Sleet whipped across the water so fiercely that men had to shield their eyes with their scarves. Artillery guns nearly slid into the river. Horses panicked as the ice groaned beneath the boats. One officer wrote, "It was a scene of horror." But Washington, standing in the storm, cloak whipping around him, refused to budge. He shouted orders. He pushed men forward. He demanded that every cannon, every horse, every soldier reach the far bank. He was cold, soaked, exhausted. But his presence filled the men with a strange, fierce resolve. If Washington could endure this, so could they. Against all odds, the crossing succeeded. Not quickly. Not smoothly. But completely. The army was across. Now came the march to Trenton. The 9-mile ordeal. Through the storm, the army trudged forward. Snow turned to freezing rain. Rain turned to hail. Hail turned to bitter wind that cut like knives. Muskets misfired for moisture. Gunpowder had to be protected under coats and blankets. Yet the army pressed on. Men left bloody footprints in the snow. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others shivered uncontrollably. Yet not one regiment broke. Not one turned back. Because ahead of them, riding silently through the storm, was Washington. He was not leading from the rear. He was not delegating the danger. He was in the front, enduring every icy gust, every mile of frozen misery. One soldier later said, "He kept us alive by the force of his will." And in the early morning hours of December 26th, as they neared Trenton, the storm began to ease. The faint glow of dawn touched the horizon. Hessian drums could be heard in the distance. Washington's moment had come. On the edge of history, Washington paused his army and sent out scouts. The Hessians were unaware. The garrison was asleep. Trenton lay before them, unguarded, unsuspecting, unprepared. Everything the Americans had endured, the retreat from New York, the starvation, the despair, the collapses, the storm, had brought them to this moment. Washington looked over his frostbitten army, their breath rising like smoke into the morning air. This was no longer a force held together by discipline or training. It was held together by desperation. By belief. By the last flickering hope that their cause still mattered. And Washington knew. If they failed now, it was truly over. But if they succeeded, the revolution might just live to see another year.